If you had to make a list of the top 10 most prevalent sins committed, and I'm going to actually specify, the 10 most prevalent sins committed by Christians. Not talking about people of the world, but if you had to write your top 10 list of sins you think Christians are most guilty of, what would you put on your list? Well, I think that would be a pretty tough assignment. And of course, it would be a very subjective sort of thing, I'm sure. But I want to suggest to you that in that reading that Tyler did for us just a few moments ago, there are a number of pretty serious sins that may well infect the people of God. Look in Romans chapter 1, beginning verse 29. Now, we understand that in the context of this, Paul was actually describing the pagan Gentile world. We understand that. But there's a list of sins here that we all have to be on guard about, and I think that we could be guilty of. Notice, filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful. This is one of those sort of cataloging of sins that I think is always pretty amazing, because it talks about some sins that we would rank as really horrible, like fornication. And certainly murder would be terrible. But what about haters of God? Yeah, haters of God, that's a terrible thing to be sure. But then you look, and in that same list is disobedient to parents. And you think, that doesn't seem like that should even go together. But they do. And one of the big takeaways from a list of sins like this is that God doesn't see sins as black and white, big and little. Sin is sin. And any sin can and does alienate us from God until it's remedied by the means that God has made available to us. But as you look at that list, the one that I want to focus on tonight is one that you might not pick out. Again, this goes to a sin that I think can very often be prevalent among God's people. I want us to focus on this sin right here, the sin of backbiting. Now again, that doesn't seem as bad as maybe fornication, murder, or hating God, but backbiting is in that list of sins, very bad sins. And here's a way you could sort of look at it. That sin of backbiting is keeping bad company, isn't it, with all the other sins that are mentioned in that list. And so tonight we want to talk about backbiting, a sin that is sadly too prevalent among us as God's people and needs to be improved. We need to work on it. We need to correct it. Notice another reference to this sin. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 20. Paul says, I fear lest when I come I shall not find you such as I would, and that I shall be found unto you such as ye would not, lest there be debates, envyings, wrath, strifes, backbitings, whisperings, swellings, and tumults. You know, it's interesting what Paul was fearful of when he would return to Corinth is that he'd find some problems there. But notice he didn't mention, I'm afraid that there'll be fornication there. I'm afraid that there'll be thievery there. I'm concerned that there'll be an excessive lot of drunkenness there. No, he said, one of the things I really fear that I'll find when I come there is this problem of backbiting. And of course, the sins associated with that we'll talk about in our lesson. So our lesson tonight is simple. We need to stop backbiting. It is obviously a problem sin for many people, and we need to understand it, address it in our own lives, be better. Stop backbiting. We'll spend just a few minutes. Dan, I'm going to tell you now, Dan asked me to keep the sermon brief tonight. I suggested to him, he said he's tired. I said, I'm tired too. You think the brethren would be upset if we had a 5-minute sermon? He didn't think you all would be upset with a 5-minute sermon. But it's going to be a little longer than 5 minutes, but we'll try to keep it on the brief side. All right, again, thanks for being here. We appreciate you all so much being present on Sunday evening. Let's talk about backbiting. First of all, let's talk about who does this, who commits this sin. Well, there are several synonyms that we will refer to tonight, and one of them is slander. He who conceals hatred has lying lips, and he who spreads slander is a fool. So backbiting would include this notion of spreading slander. And notice, he says the one who does that is a fool. This is a foolish endeavor to engage in spreading slander or backbiting. But notice that the one who does that, he is guilty of concealing hatred. The reason why you would spread slander, a foolish endeavor, is that really you don't have proper love in your heart. You may try to conceal your hatred, but it becomes exposed when you spread slander. And it's a foolish thing to do that. And so, the person who does this is a person who's not thinking right, who's foolish in their conduct. The person who does this is a person who doesn't have a proper measure of love for others. We could ask this question: who do we do it to? Well, there's this guy walking down the street. I've never seen him before. I don't know him. But let me tell you something about him. And I tell you some horrible, ugly thing about this guy that I've never even met before. I've never even seen him before. You don't know him either. He's completely unknown to us. Am I going to backbite against that guy? No, obviously not. The people that we backbite against are the people that we know. And very often it's people that we should love and have a deep, caring respect for. Unfortunately, those are the ones who are most often the targets of our backbiting. In Psalm 50, verse 20, thou sittest and speakest against thy brother. Thou slanderest thine own mother's son. So it's against brother. It's against thine own mother's son. It's against people who are close to you. Those are the ones that we typically backbite against. It's not strangers. It's not people we have just passing acquaintance with. It's usually people that we should be the closest to. And we end up backbiting against them. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, beginning verse 8, the Apostle Paul gives qualifications for deacons. We're going to be looking at these in some detail in just a few weeks. But concerning the qualifications for deacons, Paul says, likewise must the deacons be grave, not double-tongued. Even so their wives must be grave, not slanderers, sober, faithful in all things. I think the fact that this is mentioned here, now these are deacons, and specifically deacons' wives, and it said a deacon's wife. Church, here's some people who might be considered for the role of a deacon in the Lord's church. But make sure their wives don't have this problem, because lots of people do have these kind of problems. And so again, you see that this has been around. This is a problem of long standing. We could ask the question, why do we do it? Well, we already said that slandering someone, backbiting, gossiping about them is a sign of a lack of love. I mean, we wouldn't do that. If we really cared for someone, we wouldn't treat them that way. It's a sign of lack of love. But I think the reason why people will do this is because I think they think that it can be done with anonymity. I'll never be found out. I'm going to say some bad things about this guy. I got a juicy bit of gossip that I'd like to pass on to you. And I'm going to do this without fear, because I don't think that anybody will ever call me on it. I think I can do it in sort of an anonymous way, and I won't be held accountable for it. Look at Psalm 64. In Psalm 64, beginning verse 2, hide me from the secret counsel of evildoers, from the tumult of those who do iniquity, who have sharpened their tongue like a sword. They aimed bitter speech as their arrow, to shoot from concealment at the blameless. Suddenly they shoot at him and do not fear. They hold fast to themselves an evil purpose. They talk of laying snares secretly. They say, who can see them? Notice, well, there's pretty strong words in it. They sharpen their tongue like a sword. They shoot from concealment. In other words, they don't think that they're going to be seen or known or exposed for what they're doing. They talk of laying snares. Who can see the snares that I lay for this person? Again, all of that is the suggestion that I can do this kind of bad stuff and no one will know that I actually have engaged in such. Obviously, and I know I don't even have to make this point, I might possibly be the biggest gossip, slanderer, backbiter in the church, local church. But if I'm careful about how I do my sort of the under the radar business here, sort of like that text we just read from the Psalm, I'm going to maintain concealment. It might be that you all would never identify me for the evil that I'm doing. Possibly. Possibly, not likely, but possibly. But you know who won't miss that? And that is God in heaven will not miss the evil that I'm doing. So people who do it foolishly out of a lack of love. Unfortunately, they do it too often to the people that they ought to be closest to and show the most love for. And they do it because they think they can get by with it. Now, with the problem identified, how can we stop it? Well, the first thing that I want to talk about is stopping it in ourselves. That's the first place to start, right? If I've got a genuine problem here, I need to address that. And honestly, I think probably all of us to some degree or another have this issue that we need to be battling and ridding it out of our personal lives. So a great place to talk about stopping it is stopping it with myself first, right? And this would be in line with what Jesus said about get the board out of your eye before you try to pick the splinter out of your neighbor's eye. So I need to make sure I got my own act cleaned up first, right? How about this? You know, the old anti-drug campaign, just say no. How about just say no? Just quit doing it. Just stop engaging in backbiting talk. In Ephesians chapter 4, a well-known text, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 31, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice, and be kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you. Well, he mentions evil speaking. And I would put what we're discussing tonight in that category of evil speaking. What do you do with evil speaking? Put it away from you. Just stop doing that. Just make up your mind that you're not going to do that. Now, I think that obviously is going to require some self-awareness. You have to be aware that you've got the problem. You also have to be aware of the kind of situations and circumstances that tempt you to engage in this kind of this talk. But put it away. Just say, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to quit doing that. In James 4, verse 11, simply speak not evil one of another. Just don't do it. Speak not evil one of another, brethren. He that speaketh evil of his brother and judgeth his brother speaketh evil of the law and judgeth the law. But if thou judgest the law, thou art not a doer of the law, but a judge. And so, I think again, pretty simply, just say no, just quit, just don't do that. Make up your mind that you're going to stop this soul-damning sin of backbiting. Something that will help is if we have a good recognition of the consequences of doing this sort of thing. In Proverbs chapter 16, verse 28, it says, a froward man, that is a difficult man, a guy who's hard to get along with, a froward man soweth strife, and a whisperer separateth chief friends. So the person who engages in this kind of activity is going to cause strife and, unfortunately, going to cause a separation even between chief friends. And so strife and division results from this kind of conduct when we're talking in these kinds of ways. And of course, the ultimate consequence is that you could lose your soul. Here's all of Psalm 15. Read it with me. Lord, who shall abide in thy tabernacle? Now here's the question that he's going to answer. So this psalm goes on to answer that question. Who shall abide in thy tabernacle? We would probably say, who's going to live in God's house? Who shall dwell in thy holy hill? He that walketh uprightly and worketh righteousness and speaketh the truth in his heart. He that backbiteth not with his tongue, nor doeth evil to his neighbor, nor taketh up a reproach against his neighbor, in whose eyes a vile person is condemned, but he honoreth them that fear the Lord. He that sweareth to his own hurt and changeth not, he that putteth not out his money to usury or taketh reward against the innocent, he that doeth these things shall never be moved. So this psalm is stated in the positive sense. Who is it that's going to live in God's house? Who's going to be with God? And so it's addressed in a positive way, but notice, one of the things identified is he that backbiteth not with his tongue. So if you're going to be right with God, you need to not be backbiting with the tongue. But the fact of the matter is, if you do backbite with your tongue, this passage will say, well, you're not going to abide with God if you're guilty of backbiting with your tongue. So again, I think the conclusion you have to draw from that is this is a soul-damning thing. And wouldn't it be sad to, in the final day of judgment, recognize that there are Christians who ended up being lost over this sort of thing? Psalm 101 verse 5, whoever secretly slanders his neighbor, him I will destroy. No one who has a haughty look and an arrogant heart will I endure. Whoever secretly slanders his neighbor, okay, that's what we're talking about here, him I will destroy. And so again, I think we need to have just a real grasp on the seriousness of this. This is not a passing matter. This is not just a trivial, insignificant issue. This can cause us to be lost forever in hell. How can I stop? I want to stop doing this. Well, I got to make up my mind. I'm just not going to do it. I'm going to realize I got to quit it because it has my soul in jeopardy. I need to just grow up spiritually. This sin that we're talking about, this sin of backbiting, slander, and gossip, is a sign of spiritual immaturity. People who are spiritually mature don't do this sort of thing. Look in 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning verse 1. Wherefore, laying aside all malice and all guile and hypocrisies and envies and all evil speakings, as newborn babes, desire the sincere milk of the word, that ye may grow thereby. This category of things we're talking about would fall here under evil speakings. But he's saying those things need to be put aside and you need to grow. Those who do these kind of things are like babies. They're spiritual babes, and they need to grow out of that. And so one of the things that can and should help us in this matter is realize when I'm tempted to engage in this kind of talk, typically I don't talk to the person face to face that I might have an issue with. I talk behind his back. I spread slander and gossip and innuendo. I'm backbiting. The very idea of doing it behind his back. I'm backbiting against this guy. I wouldn't even dare do it to his face. I'd be ashamed to do it to his face, but I could do it behind his back. When I do that, I'm just showing that I lack all spiritual maturity. And what I need to do to resolve that is I just need to grow up and take on more mature characteristics of a Christian. Let me suggest to you that something that will certainly help in this is that we just need to get busy with productive work for the Lord. I really think, and it's been pointed out by lots of people lots of times, that one of the reasons we do this sort of thing that we're describing in our lesson tonight is that we are not keeping ourselves occupied and busy with positive things in the Lord's kingdom. And so we're not busy doing positive things, and therefore we have time to do evil, negative things. Look at this text in 1 Timothy 5, verse 13. Paul says, at the same time they learn to be idle. Okay, so here's some people who are idle. That is, they're not busy. They learn to be idle as they go around from house to house, and not merely idle, but gossips and busybodies, talking about things not proper to mention. Do you see the link there? It starts out saying they are idle. They're not busy. And since they're not busy doing good and positive things in the Lord's kingdom, they end up being gossips and busybodies. They're guilty of the kind of talking behind people's backs that we're describing in our lesson tonight. So, a big help for us all, for you and me alike, we'd be a lot less tempted to engage in this kind of backbiting talk if we were busier and more productive in the Lord's work. So, I need to do this myself. That's the place to start, right? The big starting place is get my own act together. Do it right personally. That'll help a lot. Because you know what happens if people realize that you never engage in that kind of talk, they're less likely to approach you with that kind of talk. I've never known brother so-and-so to ever do that sort of thing. I've never known sister so-and-so to ever talk in that way. I'm not going to bring this. I got a good juicy bit of gossip, but I'm not going to bring it up to her because she probably wouldn't even be inclined to listen to what I had to say. So, again, you get the idea that we need to control ourselves, and I think that we can. But what happens when we see others who do this? I think we all, thankfully, know lots of people who don't do this sort of thing, but what about those who do? And sadly, we all know some people who do engage in backbiting talk. How can we stop them? Well, first of all, obviously, don't listen to them. If they're going to do it, we don't have to assist them or be facilitators to them by giving them an audience to that kind of talk. And so simply don't listen. In Proverbs chapter 17, verse 4, it says, "An evildoer listens to wicked lips. A liar pays attention to a destructive tongue." Now, this is not talking about the person who's saying it. This is the person who listens, the person who pays attention. And they're identified as an evildoer and a liar. Get this is kind of interesting. It's not saying you're an evildoer because you say bad things. It's not saying you're a sinner because you say and do bad things. In this verse, you're an evildoer and a liar if you listen and pay attention to people saying things that they shouldn't say. That's kind of an important thing to dwell upon, isn't it? I tell you, I would never say those kind of things to someone about someone else. I just would not do it. It's not in me to do that. But listen, what have you heard? Tell me what you've heard. No, I love to listen to that sort of thing. I wouldn't repeat it. I don't tell anybody else. But boy, I love to hear it. The very hearing of it is a contributor to the problem itself, right? And so we need to just say, not only am I not going to do that, I am not going to be an audience for those who do speak that way. And I think pretty quickly people will begin to realize that if people are going to keep doing this, and my guess is there are going to be some individuals who keep doing this irregardless of anything that can be said. But they're going to find out pretty soon that you're not a person inclined to listen. And that'll be a big help. That will slow them down at least by virtue of the fact that you won't listen to them. Certainly don't repeat what you've heard. And this goes very much in line with what we've been already saying. But in regards to what others do, so somebody's going to come to you with some juicy piece of gossip or slander. They're backbiting. They're talking behind someone's back. And I think it's unavoidable that at some point you're likely to hear something that should never have been said in the first place. If that's the case, obviously don't repeat that. Break the chain, if you will. Because that's what happens. This thing just keeps snowballing, isn't it? You know, even sometimes we talk about the gossip grapevine. There's a grapevine of gossip. Well, you know, if I cut that off, if I stop that from going out further, then I've helped in that way. I heard what I didn't really want to hear, but at least I'm not going to spread it further. In Proverbs 17, verse 4, "An evildoer listens to wicked lips, a liar pays attention to a destructive tongue." That's what we were just reading. But look at verse 9 in the same context. "He who covers a transgression seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates intimate friends." Repeating a matter. That's in that same context of an evildoer who listens and a liar who pays attention. Verse 9 says if you repeat a matter, you're going to bring about those terrible consequences that we talked about earlier. So absolutely do not repeat something, even if you are incidentally or accidentally exposed to something that you should not have heard. Don't repeat it. And then finally, could I suggest return good for evil. Here's a guy who's backbiting. Or you heard that someone is backbiting against you. What do you do with this, I think, unfortunately, too prevalent sin of backbiting? Well, I think we can imitate Paul's example when he said we should return good for evil. Look at this text. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 12, being reviled, we bless. Being persecuted, we suffer it. Being defamed, we entreat. Here's the part I want you to concentrate on. Being defamed, that would be this kind of talk that we have in mind in our lesson tonight. What did Paul say? Oh man, that guy talked really bad about me. He said a bunch of stuff that should never have been said. And of course, he did it behind my back, because that's what these guys do, right? They always are working behind the back. He defamed me. And I'm going to tell you something. I'm going to get even with that guy, because I got some good, juicy bits of information against him. And so since he did this to me, you can be sure I'm going to do this against him. No. Paul said, being defamed, we entreat. And so how could we say this? He didn't get down and wallow in the mud with those who were guilty of these sins against him. He returned good for evil. And I believe that we can and should do the same thing. So, backbiting. I think it's got to rank pretty high up there on that list of, remember I asked you at the start, what would be your top 10 prevalent sins committed by even Christians? Well, that's a very subjective question to ask, but I got to believe that backbiting would have to be on that top 10 list, and possibly pretty high up on the top 10 list of sins. We're all tempted, right? So recognize, identify what the problem is, stop it yourself, and do what you can to stop others. That's the way that this has to be addressed. Back to our list where we started. In Romans chapter 1, verse 29 through 31, in that long catalog of sins, these were actually the sins of the pagan Gentile world. God's people are often guilty of the same, but right there's that backbiting. And it's a sin that God despises. It's a sin that can cost our souls in hell. We need to be careful to avoid backbiting. Thanks for your good attention to what we've had to say, and hope it's helpful. I hope it'll encourage us all, because I really do think that this is a category of things that we all need to constantly be on guard about. It's just way too easy to fall into those bad practices. Thanks for listening tonight. We're going to sing a song of invitation. If you need our help in getting your life right with God, be it by obeying the gospel initially, or if you're a Christian in need of the prayers of the saints, if there's any way we can help you, let us know while we stand and sing this song.